So, thank you for watching today's video. I've got today with me Liana Kerzner. I think all the gamers, the fanboys, everyone's really envying me today. So I came across you, Liana. I was watching David Pacman. It was one of those days I was scrolling through YouTube, saw David Pacman, saw you. I said, you look familiar, saw the name. I know that name. And watched the video and then checked into you. I hadn't seen you for a number of years since I saw, I used to watch you. Big fan. You and that co-host of yours, actually that sidekick of yours. What was that? The shoe or something like that? A glove?
Ed the Sock?
Ed the Sock,
no,
that's the guy.
The shoe is Read Along, which is a Canadian program for children. Ours, Ed the Sock, is a Canadian program for adults. It's easy to get them confused. And Anana was the French-Canadian program for junkies or stoners or something like that. I'm not sure who that show was for, but it was awesome. But yeah,
Right.
Canada has a proud tradition of puppets. I have no idea why. And of course, Mr. Dress Up. Mr. Dress Up and the Friendly Giant too. Maybe that's the common originator of all Canadian puppetry stuff.
Right. Well, I'm so glad to have you on. I like to have interesting or controversial people, or getting people who speak honestly, who aren't afraid of political correctness. Doesn't mean that they have to be jerks. It's just that they're able to talk about topics, not to be afraid. And I've got 3 daughters. So anytime I see a woman who's out there, she can speak her mind. She's not trying to present herself as some way that, the power structure wants them to be. I think you've always kind of come across as, I think, yourself, or whatever persona yourself may be. But it's always been very interesting. I loved you and Ed on Ed the Sock. The back and forth between the two of you, so much spontaneity, hilarity ensued all the time. So I'm really glad to have you on.
A lot of it was ad-libbed. A lot of it was ad-libbed. We'd do a structure for the show, but it would be point form notes.
Right.
And it's sort of, when you work in comedy, you get your certain beats where it's very predictive. So you have to kind of get, like my job, as the straight man woman, was to set up Ed for jokes. And
Right.
so I sort of had to predict where I thought he was going to land. I had a pretty decent accuracy record. Sometimes it didn't work, but most of the time it did. I could sort of, softball something that he can go. And
Right.
That's an interesting part of comedy, is that if you don't get that structural setup, then things can become a hot mess really quickly. I enjoy doing comedic stuff because it is more challenging, but at the same time, I think it is. I'm a big fan of George Carlin, Howard Stern, Lenny Bruce back in the day. The stuff Sarah Silverman's doing. I even respect a lot of the things Amy Schumer's doing, because there are these rigid social structures that women are expected to conform to, just in terms of the archetypes you see in the media. If you look at the traditional sitcom, take The Simpsons, for instance. Homer and Bart and Mr. Burns and Smithers and all these male characters are allowed to be these crazy, at times buffoonish, they get all the big laughs. Marge and Lisa are expected to be the grown-ups in the room,
Right.
and be better and smarter than everybody else at all the things. That's not life. Who are the female characters that get to land jokes? Marge's spinster sisters, right? So the only time a woman is allowed to be funny is when you disconnect from female sexuality. Obviously, my career has completely defied this, and that's deliberate. When I started working in TV, that was an element of women in the media that always made me very uncomfortable. Not the fear of nudity, the reality that it was required for women in a lot of ways. And so I sort of set out to go, well, look, this is one of the few areas of expertise that people don't have to have any direct experience in to talk about. Let's do better. Let's do the pinup photo shoots. Let's do the men's magazines. Let's talk to porn stars. Let's, engage in those environments and get some direct experience, not just about what it looks like, but what it feels like experientially to be there, to be on those sets, to see the sausage made, pardon the pun, in so many ways,
Right.
And I'm so glad I did it. It's had some interesting social repercussions that I've then used to inform my previous work. But it's field work, right? It's field research. And it's so strange that this subject of gender we don't have as much. We have a lot of philosophy, right? We have a lot of philosophical stuff that suffers from scope creep. So we get this philosophical idea that's all well and good, but then it seems to break containment and end up in discussions of biology or discussions of psychology or discussions in, of course it ends up in politics, but
Right.
that's when it starts to become a real challenge, because everything's so polarized now that people are playing to their various bases as opposed to speaking to each other. And anybody that's had to get down and do the hard work of trying to figure out, okay, what's really going on here? What are the best outcomes for our various constituencies? Know that going out and preaching to your base isn't where that comes from. It's the boring, not fun, behind closed doors work of, rolling up your sleeves, getting down to it, and trying to find some common ground that really affects the common good. And I don't think there's enough of that going on right now.
Well, there's definitely not. And you don't grow until you can communicate with, learn from, disagree with the quote unquote the other side. But that communication has to happen. And as you're saying, it's echo chambers that are being created, all these different silos, and no one's communicating with each other. And I'll tell you, the sad thing is, I've tried to reach out to a number of people who I know disagree with me. How do I know? Because once I tweet something, they're all over me.
Yeah.
And I say, look, we can't have a good, honest discussion over 140 characters at a time. Now, I'll do that. I'll do like 30, one of X, two of X.
Tweet storms? Yeah.
I do that, but I'm not trying to be aggressive or anything. I'm just trying to get a point across, and I don't, 140 characters just doesn't cut it. And no, it's not mansplaining when you're being long and articulate, okay? I'm verbose.
Oh, you get that? You get the mansplaining?
Okay, so one of the more recent videos I did was, I won't go into the whole background, but somebody put a post, and I thought they were being sarcastic against someone who had attacked me. So they wrote, Dr. Amitay, you can add mansplaining transphobe to your title. And I thought it was pretty funny because, again, I thought
me too. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Then I realized after I said, oh, you're not joking. Of course I'm not. And we had this whole thing. So I invited her. I invited another person, all to come on, speak on the podcast. Somebody else did the exact same thing. The only good thing was he and I, we end up having a podcast together and talking about this, because the art of discussion, the art of listening, it's lost, it seems. So, I've tried to have people with whom I disagree on. I've had a few people who are controversial, and I'll explain. First of all, I'll praise the hell out of them. I say, look, it takes courage to go out there, put yourself out there, knowing that you're putting your career at risk in this day and age. I've done that as well, by the way, and I'm not doing it for the sake of doing it. I'm doing it because I do believe in honesty. I do believe in doing a good job, and I stand up front of a class, and I want to be able to discuss things not based on ideology, but based on facts, on evidence. And I'll tell my students all the time. I'll say, look, here's what the science says, here's what my clinical experience says, and I'll say, okay, and here's my opinion. And I'll say there are different areas, and they might, merge, but the fact is, I will never pretend that my opinion is fact. And, that's different from a lot of my colleagues in quackademia, which I've stolen from Graham Hancock. Joe Rogan has them all the time. So, sorry?
Did he come up with that term?
Well, I heard him use it, and so I've been using it as well. I love it. Quackademia. I think it really captures a lot.
And it's funny. I do the same thing in this series I'm working on now, Lady Bits. That's a fundamental principle, and I get accused of fence sitting. I love it when things become verbs, right? Sitting on the fence, and it's not. To me, that's a mark of intellectual, not just dishonesty, not just honesty, but curiosity. To say, This is what we know, this is what we kind of know, like this is what we're delving into now. Here's my opinion, or here's my prediction. That's a scientific method.
Right.
Right there, right? Like, you have to make a hypothesis to test the hypothesis. And this, especially in the issue of transphobia, because I've been accused of that myself, and unfortunately those things stick, and they are cudgels in a discourse. If that accusation angers me more than anyone, because the reality is very few people in a large city like Toronto are transphobic.
Right.
Phobic has a very specific meaning, which means you are afraid or hate the affected group.
You have an irrational fear of is in fact
Yes.
what it really means.
Yes. Most people are not afraid of trans people. They don't understand it.
Exactly.
That is not the same. And it's funny, I'm Jewish, and we have this Passover tradition that there's 4 types of children that you have to teach in different ways. And there's, the wise child, the wicked child, the simple child, and the child unable to inquire. In this whole trans issue, the latter 2 tend to be where most people are. They don't know about all the P's and Q's, but they're not trying to start trouble. And too often people leap to attack people for just not knowing the right words to use. And that breeds intolerance, I believe, because now someone went from a neutral position to having an actively bad experience.
Exactly.
And now they are afraid of engaging with the trans community. Now they are transphobic. These people, these I don't even call them activists, they're aggressivists, actually create self-fulfilling prophecies in terms of that fear factor. There are a lot of people afraid to engage. And I mean, I grew up in the Jane Finch neighborhood of Toronto, where fear has a different context there. But multiculturalism was a huge thing, and we spent a lot of time breaking down those barriers. And to me, it's the height of this thing that people want to slap around calling privilege, to attack someone for not knowing something. I find that is such a conceit that people think they can jump all over someone for not knowing through no fault of their own. And that bothers me, because I think it's actually anti-intellectual. I think it's anti-discourse. I think it's anti-progress. And this is where you get into the idea of regressivism, of, the regressive left, and they call it, the alt-right and the control left, kind of in pop culture parlance. And that's an issue too, right? Because as you talked about mansplaining is not a technical term. And my joke for that is condescension has no gender.
Right.
So manspreading is something different. Mansplaining is a cute little thing to put in a coffee mug, but you got to be careful where you fling that accusation. And I think too many people use it as something that has meaning outside of a joke. And it really doesn't. If you're accusing someone essentially of gendered condescension, you better be able to elocute why you think that is. Burden of proof is on the accuser.
Right.
That makes me very unpopular in certain fields, because, there's the whole lived experience quotient that there's a valid point to that. You can't convince someone who is unwilling to be convinced. But I don't think most people, especially most educated people, are like that. I think every so often you do find someone who is so entrenched in their particular pet theory that if, their career will be in shambles if that theory is disproven. There's a lot of that. I mean, that's where you get the quackademia that you mentioned. Somebody sells a ton of books on an outrageous theory, and now they have a professional benefit to defending a theory I personally think a lot of them don't even believe.
Right.
Yeah. It's just, it makes them money.
Right.
And I think we owe it, this whole am I my brother's keeper thing. I think we owe it to ourselves to take risks for the greater good. But we have this tabloid media now that just craps on anyone who tries. And I think for various reasons, and I'll spare the mass common media theory stuff, but for various reasons, that has infected everything. That catty tabloid approach to issues where, if you want to seem above it, I'll shit on something. And I think that's a lot of what's led us to this point. The kids coming through college right now are the generation of reality TV. Mm-hmm. And what is the basis of reality TV? Torturing. Reality TV is a consent to be tortured, right? These people who think fame for fame itself is a noble goal, go on there and suffer through all these indignities for so-called entertainment. It's almost like the modern day gladiator arena where someone's going to go down and there's going to be blood and there's going to be tears, and this is entertainment. I know I rambled there, but it's just sort of a connection of ideas that happened to fly out of my mouth. That happens.
Okay. Well, darn, there were like 5 places I wanted to jump in. But you were woman-splaining so much, I didn't get a chance.
Oh, darn. Yeah.